What's up guys, welcome back to the channel. So a lot of y'all have been asking me about color grading lately and specifically working with log footage. And if you don't know what log footage is, basically it is the flattest format that cameras can record video in. So when you're just starting out, it looks really weird, it's confusing, it's hard to know what to do. So I wanted to help y'all out with a pretty practical workflow because that's what I use for every project, and I figured hopefully it's gonna help some of y'all. So thanks so much for joining. Now let's get into it. All right, so for the first step, the main thing that I like to do is get the overall contrast set. So we're converting the log footage into a more normal looking footage. And then we're gonna go from there to tweak it a bit depending on how the shot is, how much dynamic range there is, how much color you actually want in this shot, and whatever specific tweaks that you need. There's construction like right outside my window, so if you hear any weird noises, that's what it is. All right, so let's start off with a simple one first, and then we'll do a little bit more complicated as it goes. All right, so first we're gonna do the curves. So we're gonna go into the RGB curves, get our general contrast going. Okay. Looks pretty good over here on the histograms. Trying to stretch it to where something gets close to 100, something gets close to 0. And then we're gonna go into basic correction tab and add a bit of saturation. See where we're at. Okay, so the goal with curves is basically this represents 0, this represents 100. So the brightest stuff, and what you want to do is pull down some of the darker parts. You can see it affecting over here as you pull this around. It is pulling that a lot closer to all the way black, which is 0 over here. And then same thing with the highlights. So you can keep it muted, or you can add a lot more contrast. Pull that up closer to 100. Depending on what the shot is, so this is a sunrise, you don't necessarily want something to be at 100 on these histograms. So for this one, I'm gonna set it to where the brightest thing is around 80 or 90. Because you want it to look like a sunrise. Okay, so something like that. Maybe a little bit less shadows so that we can keep some more detail in this mountain. If you want to do just super basic color grading, you could probably just keep that if you wanted to, but we're gonna make it a little bit better in the next steps. All right, so let's do the same thing on a more high dynamic range shot. So we've got this kind of interior exterior view. This stuff is all SLOG3 shot on a Sony FX3, in case you're wondering. So we're gonna go in, add the curves. So for this one, let's keep those shadows a little bit brighter because we want the detail in this darker area. And then we're gonna do that. So for a more dynamic shot, you want it to be a little bit flatter still in the end, but you don't want it to end up looking like this, looking really flat. So we're gonna do a few more tweaks further along to make it still look punchy, but also keep that dynamic range and keep that detail from shadows to highlights. So I'm gonna go in and add the saturation just like last time. Okay, and let's go back to the curve, see where we're at. So as you notice, adding the S curve adds contrast, and that boosts the saturation in itself. So you kind of have to go back and forth on some of these settings because as you adjust one, it's going to affect the other. So we went from this to this, and it's already looking pretty good. always got to have a good editing beverage. So the second step that I like to do is to kind of tailor the color grade specific to the shot. So I'm going to go in and do some similar adjustments that we did in the first step, but these are going to be a little bit more custom. So we're going to add a little bit more contrast in the blacks, or we're going to add a little bit more contrast overall, or we're going to pull up the highlights or pull up the midtones. So depending on what is in the shot, it's going to be different. So we're going into basic correction tab, and we are going to be watching these histograms, and all we're going to be changing is a few settings. So watch this. So we're pulling the blacks down for starters. If you got anything that needs to be solid black, this is what you want to do. You want to pull the blacks down and watch the histogram to make sure it goes all the way down to 0. Okay? If you go too far, it's a little bit much. Then you just lose all the information. So we're gonna go there. We're gonna adjust the whites. So I'm gonna pull it down just a little bit. Highlights, pull it down just a little bit. Bring back some of that sky detail. Pull up the shadows a little bit maybe. See how that's looking. And this is why I really like Sony SLOG3, FX3, because you've got a lot of room to work with. If I had shot this on my EOS R, this mountain range would probably be all black. You wouldn't have the details that you do on this to work with. So that's one of the big differences on video for different cameras. The main goals for this step are to flatten it out a little bit, custom to the shot, pull in the details where you want them, and then we're going to also fix the temperature and tint just a little bit. So I want to warm it up a little bit. It's a little bit cold looking. Wasn't that cold. Just a little bit. Okay, and here you can adjust your tint if it's a little bit off. Don't really need to on this one. So that's it for that step. Let's do it to the other one. All right, so same thing. So we're just gonna pull down the whites a little bit, pull up the shadows a little bit, pull down the highlights a little bit, pull down the blacks. Oh, need my scopes up. Pull down the blacks here. I like to work with this blacks slider because you can still keep the dynamic range and the overall contrast pretty soft, but that pulls down those like darker blacks. So it still makes it look punchy. You don't want the dark stuff to just all look gray. So pretty close to black is what I go for. All right, so we're on to step 3, and once you get good at this stuff, it's fast. It's not gonna take you 20 minutes per clip, so don't worry. Basically, all we're gonna do on this step is finalize the color grade. So whether you are toning down some of the colors, adding some more specific targeted contrast, or if you are going to be taking away some of the colors, that's what we're doing in step 3. So we're gonna go back into curves. We're gonna go to the hue and saturation curves. This is where you can pick out custom colors, change them, and all that stuff. So you just use this eyedropper. So we're gonna grab this green. I want that to be a little bit more saturated. So you just pull this up. You can shift this around to get it a little bit more precise as you watch the footage change. You can do this with any color. So we're gonna grab this mountain. It should be somewhere green and blue. If you are doing interiors and you have like hue tints on ceilings or walls, or want to get rid of a little bit of yellow, you can do this and drag it downward, and that's going to reduce the amount of saturation on the yellow. So that's super handy too. If you want to change a color completely, so let's say you want to grab this green again and make it a little bit more warm looking, you can pull that and voila, it turns reddish. Be careful, because if you do too much of any of this stuff, your footage is going to start to fall apart, especially if you don't have a really high-end camera. You can do a custom point too, so just doing this. I'm trying to make that sky bluer, but think we're gonna have to do LUMA saturation down here. So you can do the same thing, grab a spot. This represents your brightness values, LUMA. So we want the highlights to be saturated. So as you can see right there, all the highlights get a little more saturated. So for this one, we could make the shadows a little bit desaturated to give that a little bit more of a saturated look on the highlights. Like I was saying earlier, as you do all this stuff, it changes everything. So you can go back and tweak the settings we did on step 1 or step 2, and they'll have a little bit different effect each time. So it's a push and pull. I like to go back and forth. Sometimes I'll pull down like this on the very top part, pull in some of those super bright highlights. I'm liking this being a little bit brighter actually. All right, so that's about how I want this one. Here's what we got. So we started out here, and we got all the way to there. It looks like a nice warm sunrise, so that's what I was going for. All right, let's go back to this other one and finish this one out. So go into curves, let's close those, hue and saturation curves. So let's go ahead and grab this purpley color, work with that a little bit. Let's get the blue sky. And it's cool because it shows you what hue you're dragging it to. So some people will go a little more teal to get a little more cinematic looking. It's not bad. So one thing I actually like to do is add another lumetri panel to it, and you can do another curve that's a little bit more custom and keep pushing that grade a little bit more. Especially when you have a really flat footage, this can help a lot. I'm just actually gonna scoot this black over and scoot this down. So we just added a little bit more punch. You can do the same thing probably with the black slider and the hue, saturation, shadow, highlight, and all that stuff. But once you get used to using curves, they're pretty easy, and I kind of prefer them. And now we're done. Everything looks really good. Obviously you could keep going and going and going on the color grading rabbit hole, but you gotta stop at some point and call it quits. At some point it's good enough, it's gonna work for the client, and you can move on. So yeah. All right, so that's it. That's what I do for every single shot. It varies a lot depending on the dynamic range and the amount of saturation and color that you want. But these steps are what I do for pretty much every single project. As you're working through these things, you can go ahead and save them as a preset and copy that over from shot to shot to where you can use it later for similar projects and speed up that workflow just a little bit. All that stuff adds up and helps you get better over time and helps you speed things up over time the more you get used to it. So I hope this video was helpful. If you're new, make sure to subscribe and click the bell to where you get notified when there's new videos. You don't want to miss out on some of the cool stuff coming up. You guys are awesome, and as always, I look forward to seeing y'all in the next one. Peace.